The night was quiet, too quiet for a city that never really slept. The street lights flickered, casting long shadows over the empty roads. Officers Daniel Carter and Mike Lawson were patrolling their usual route, their squad car gliding through the streets like a silent guardian. It was supposed to be a routine shift, just another night of keeping the city safe. But they had no idea they were about to step into something much bigger than anything they had ever faced. "Slow night," Mike muttered, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, but let's not jinx it." As if on cue, the radio crackled to life. A dispatcher's voice came through, calm but firm. "All units be advised. Black sedan, license plate 7XK912, spotted driving erratically near Lincoln Avenue. Possible DUI. Proceed with caution." Mike glanced at Daniel, raising an eyebrow. "That's just a few blocks from us." Daniel nodded. "Let's check it out." They turned onto Lincoln Avenue, scanning the road ahead. And there it was. A sleek, black sedan moving just a little too fast, swerving slightly before straightening out. Something about it felt off. They exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Flipping on the lights, Mike gave a quick burst of the siren. "Let's see what this guy's deal is." The sedan hesitated for a second, then slowly pulled over to the side of the road. The officers stepped out, hands near their holsters, not because they expected trouble, but because experience had taught them to never let their guard down. Daniel approached the driver's side while Mike covered the passenger's side. The tinted window rolled down, and inside sat a man in a crisp, dark suit, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. He turned his head slowly, revealing sharp features and piercing eyes that held no fear. Instead, there was something else, something colder. "Evening, sir," Daniel said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "We noticed some erratic driving. Have you been drinking tonight?" The man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was calculated. "No, I haven't had a drop." Daniel studied him carefully. Something wasn't right. He wasn't slurring, his movements weren't sluggish, but there was an edge to his voice that sent a quiet warning through Daniel's gut. "License and registration, please," Mike added from the other side. The man didn't move right away. Instead, he sighed, almost as if he were disappointed. "Officers, I don't think you realize who you're talking to." Daniel's grip on his flashlight tightened. He'd heard that line before, usually from someone with a little too much money and a little too much confidence. And who might that be? The man reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a badge. Not just any badge, Internal Affairs. Mike exhaled sharply. "You've got to be kidding me." Daniel stared at the badge, then at the man's face. Internal Affairs. The division that policed the police. The guys who looked for corruption, for officers who stepped out of line. Every cop in the city knew them, and none of them wanted to end up in their crosshairs. But something didn't add up. What was the head of Internal Affairs doing out here, alone, driving erratically in the middle of the night? Daniel kept his voice even. "That's an impressive badge, sir, but it doesn't change the fact that we pulled you over for a reason." The man's smile didn't falter, but there was a new glint in his eyes, one that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "I understand," he said smoothly. "But trust me, officers, you don't want to take this any further." A thick silence filled the space between them. It was a warning, unspoken but crystal clear. Mike stepped closer, his own instincts kicking in. "Sir, if you have nothing to hide, this should be simple. Let's see your ID, and we'll be on our way." The man didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, watching them like a predator sizing up its prey. "Are you sure you want to do that?" Daniel and Mike exchanged a quick glance. The air was different now, charged, like the moment before a storm. Something wasn't right, and they were about to find out just how deep this went. Mike tightened his jaw. He had dealt with all kinds of people on the job: liars, manipulators, power-hungry types who thought a badge or a title made them untouchable. But there was something different about this man. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself. It wasn't arrogance. It was something worse. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, keeping his stance firm. "Sir, this doesn't have to be complicated. Just hand over your ID, and we'll be done here." The man exhaled through his nose, almost amused. "You're persistent. I respect that." He reached into his coat again, this time pulling out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a driver's license tucked behind his internal affairs badge. Daniel took it, scanning the name. "Richard Langston," he read aloud. The name didn't ring a bell, but that wasn't surprising. Internal Affairs wasn't the type to mingle with regular officers unless they were investigating something or someone. Mike glanced at the ID from his side of the car. The photo matched the man in front of them, but something still didn't sit right. "Mr. Langston, where are you coming from tonight?" Langston hesitated, just for a second. "Work." Daniel studied his face. "At this hour?" Langston's lips curled slightly. "My job doesn't keep normal hours." That was true enough, but it didn't explain the erratic driving, the evasiveness. And then there was the way he had warned them not to take this further. Mike crossed his arms. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle, sir?" Langston's fingers drummed against the steering wheel again. He stared at them for a long moment, then, with a slow and deliberate movement, opened the car door. As he stepped out, Daniel noticed something. No sign of nerves, no frustration, not even irritation, just quiet, controlled calculation. Langston straightened his coat. "Am I under arrest?" "No," Daniel said, "but we need to make sure everything's in order." Langston nodded, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was letting them play out their little routine, as if he already knew how this would end. Mike walked to the rear of the sedan, shining his flashlight over the trunk. "You mind popping this open?" Langston smirked. "That won't be necessary." Daniel arched a brow. "And why's that?" "Because if you open it, you won't like what you find." The air turned ice cold. Daniel didn't react immediately, but his hand instinctively rested near his holster. Mike had stopped moving, his flashlight frozen midair. Daniel kept his voice steady. "Care to explain?" Langston tilted his head slightly, almost like he was testing their reaction. Then finally he spoke. "You're both good officers. I can tell. That's why I'm giving you a chance to walk away." Daniel could hear his own pulse in his ears. "That's not how this works." Langston exhaled as if disappointed. "I was hoping you'd say that." Mike, never one to play mind games, stepped forward. "Trunk, now." Langston held his gaze for a moment, then shrugged. "All right." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the key fob, and clicked it. The trunk popped open with a quiet click. Daniel moved cautiously, stepping toward the back of the car. Mike was right beside him, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then they saw it. Not a body, not drugs, nothing illegal in the traditional sense, but something just as dangerous. Inside the trunk were thick, sealed envelopes, dozens of them, folders stacked neatly, and on each one, the emblem of the police department. Internal Affairs case files. Mike exhaled sharply. "What the hell is this?" Langston leaned casually against the side of the car. "Evidence. Reports. Secrets." His eyes flickered toward Daniel. "You see, gentlemen, not everyone who wears a badge deserves it. Some people in this city, even the ones you might admire, have been playing a very different game." Daniel reached for one of the files, flipping it open. The names inside were familiar. Officers, detectives, even some high-ranking officials. Reports of misconduct, corruption, things that never made it past the paperwork stage. Things that were supposed to be buried. Mike scanned over Daniel's shoulder. "Why are you driving around with this in your trunk?" Langston's smirk finally faded. "Because I can't trust my own department." Daniel's stomach tightened. He'd always known corruption existed in some corners of the force. Every cop did. But this? This was different. This was systematic. Langston watched them carefully. Now do you see why I told you to walk away? Mike shook his head, his voice low. You think we're just going to let this go? Langston's expression didn't change. No, I think you're going to have to make a choice. Daniel met his gaze. And what choice is that? Langston's voice was quiet, but firm. Either you take those files and pretend this stop never happened, or you go back to your station, report this in, and find out just how deep this hole goes. Silence, heavy. Daniel's grip tightened around the file in his hand. This was bigger than them now. And there was no turning back. Daniel stared at the files in his hands, the weight of them much heavier than just paper and ink. This wasn't just evidence. This was a loaded gun, pointed at the heart of the department. Every name on those pages was someone with a badge, someone who had sworn to uphold the law. But not all of them had. Some had bent the rules. Others had broken them completely. And if Langston was telling the truth, this wasn't just a list of past cases. This was a warning. Mike exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. This is insane. If what you're saying is true, you're sitting on a bomb. Why come to us? Why not go through the right channels? Langston chuckled, but there was no humor in it. The right channels? He shook his head. The moment I walk into headquarters with this, half the department will know before I even make it to my office. You think I don't know how this works? Cases like these don't just disappear on their own. People make them disappear. Daniel looked at Langston carefully. And what makes you think we won't turn you in? Langston's smirk returned, just a little. Because you haven't yet. He wasn't wrong. If they were going to arrest him, they would have done it already. But instead, here they were, standing in the middle of an empty street, debating what to do next. Mike shook his head. Even if we believe you, even if all of this is real, what do you expect us to do? We're not detectives. We're patrol officers. Langston nodded as if he had been expecting that response. And that's exactly why I chose you. He met their eyes, one at a time. You're not tied to anyone. You don't owe favors. You're clean. That makes you dangerous. Daniel felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who did the job right, who didn't cut corners. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just about doing the right thing. This was about survival. Mike turned to Daniel, lowering his voice. We can't just walk away from this. Daniel knew that. He also knew that if they handled this wrong, they'd be the ones in those files next, targets instead of officers. Langston took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. I don't need you to solve this. I just need you to get these files to someone who can. Daniel glanced down at the papers again, flipping through page after page. These weren't just accusations. There were reports, timestamps, internal memos. Some of these cases were buried years ago, swept under the rug before they could even see the light of day. Then he froze. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto a familiar name. Mike must have noticed the shift in his expression. What? Daniel turned the file around so Mike could see it. His partner's face darkened immediately. The name wasn't just familiar, it was personal. Lieutenant James Holloway. Their commanding officer, their mentor. The man who had taught them everything they knew about being good cops. Mike clenched his jaw. This has to be a mistake. Langston's voice remained steady. It's not. Daniel flipped through the pages quickly, searching for anything that would prove otherwise. But there it was, in black and white. Evidence of bribes, of cases manipulated or buried entirely. There were names of officers they had worked with, names of victims whose complaints never made it past his desk. Mike shook his head. No way. Holloway's one of the best. He stopped himself, but his eyes said everything. Because deep down, they both knew. Holloway had always been careful, but there had been moments, small things that didn't seem like much at the time. Decisions that felt off. Warnings he had given them about playing smart and not asking too many questions. It had never felt wrong before, but now, Now it all made sense. Langston sighed. Look, I know this isn't easy, but you needed to see it for yourselves. Daniel felt a pit growing in his stomach. If Holloway was involved, that meant this wasn't just some isolated corruption case. This went deep, this went high, and they were now standing right in the middle of it. Mike took a step back, hands on his hips, his breathing uneven. So what do we do? Langston didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper. He handed it to Daniel. Meet this guy, he said. He's a federal investigator. He's been trying to build a case for months, but he's been hitting walls at every turn. These files, they might be what he needs. Daniel took the paper but didn't look at it yet. His mind was still spinning. Mike ran a hand through his hair. If Holloway's involved, he's going to know we saw this. He's going to come looking for us. Langston nodded. That's why you have to move fast. Daniel finally looked down at the paper. A name and a number. No agency listed, just a single point of contact. He looked back up at Langston. And what about you? Langston smirked again, but this time there was a hint of something else. Something almost tired. Don't worry about me. Just worry about yourselves. Mike let out a slow breath. This is insane. Daniel nodded. Yeah. For a moment, none of them spoke. The night air felt heavier now, the street quieter than before. Then, from a distance, the faint sound of another engine approaching. Langston straightened. You need to go. Now. Mike didn't argue. He slammed the trunk shut, while Daniel tucked the files under his arm. Langston stepped back toward his car. You've got a head start, but it won't last. Be smart. Daniel climbed into the squad car, heart pounding. Mike slid into the driver's seat, and before he could even think, the car was moving. As they pulled away, Daniel glanced in the side mirror. Langston stood there, watching them go, and for the first time, Daniel realized, whatever Langston had gotten himself into, he wasn't expecting to make it out. Mike tightened his grip on the wheel. We're really doing this. Daniel stared down at the files in his hands, at the truth staring back at him. We don't have a choice. And with that, they disappeared into the night, knowing that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The squad car sped through the empty streets, headlights slicing through the darkness. Mike gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale from the pressure. Daniel sat beside him, the files still clutched in his hands. The weight of them wasn't just physical anymore. It was the kind that settled deep in his chest, pressing down on every breath. Neither of them spoke for a while. The city around them felt quieter than usual, like even the buildings knew something was wrong. Mike finally exhaled, shaking his head. I can't believe this. Holloway, of all people. Daniel didn't answer right away. He was still trying to process it himself. Holloway had been more than just their commanding officer. He had been a mentor, someone they had trusted without question. The idea that he had been part of something this deep, this corrupt, it made Daniel's stomach turn. We need to meet this investigator, Daniel said finally, glancing at the slip of paper Langston had given him. The name was unfamiliar, just a single first name and a phone number. No agency, no badge number. That made him nervous. Mike let out a bitter laugh. And what if this guy's in on it too? What if Langston just sent us straight to someone who's gonna bury us? Daniel didn't have an answer for that. They were walking blind, and every choice they made felt like stepping onto thin ice. But they had already crossed a line the second they opened that trunk. There was no going back. A stoplight turned red ahead, and Mike hit the brakes, coming to a sharp halt at the intersection. The streets were empty, but the eerie silence made Daniel uneasy. He glanced around, his instincts on high alert. Then he saw them. 2 black SUVs, parked on the opposite side of the street. The headlights were off, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. The kind of unmarked vehicles used for quiet operations, the kind that didn't want attention. Daniel's pulse quickened. Mike. I see them. The light turned green, but neither of them moved. The SUVs didn't either. Mike tightened his grip on the wheel. They're waiting for us. Daniel scanned the side streets, looking for an escape route. Turn left. Now. Mike didn't hesitate. He yanked the wheel hard, tires screeching as they veered onto a narrow road between buildings. The moment they turned, the SUVs roared to life behind them. They're following, Mike muttered, pressing down on the gas. The squad car lurched forward, weaving through the dimly lit streets. Daniel twisted in his seat, watching as the black vehicles closed in. There was no siren, no flashing lights, just silent pursuit. This wasn't a routine stop. This was something else. "They're not trying to pull us over," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. Mike understood immediately. "They don't want us talking to anyone." Daniel's heart pounded. "We can't let them catch us." Mike's foot pressed harder against the gas pedal. The engine roared as they sped through an intersection, running a red light. The SUVs followed effortlessly, their powerful engines closing the distance. Daniel grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3 to 4 requesting immediate backup at." Static. He tried again. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Nothing. Mike glanced at him. Jammed. Daniel gritted his teeth. Looks like it. This wasn't just a couple of rogue officers trying to cover their tracks. This was organized. Planned. The road ahead curved sharply, leading into a tunnel beneath the freeway. Mike took it, hoping to lose them in the shadows. The second they entered the tunnel, the headlights behind them flickered off. Daniel's grip tightened. "They're going dark." Mike didn't slow down. He swerved past an abandoned vehicle, pushing the squad car to its limits. "We need to get out of this tunnel, if they box us in." A pair of headlights flared to life ahead of them. Another SUV, blocking the exit. Daniel's stomach dropped. Brake. Mike spun the wheel at the last second, forcing the car into a sharp turn. The tires screamed against the pavement as they barely avoided slamming into the barricade. The squad car skidded sideways, crushing against the tunnel wall. Metal crunched, sparks flew, but the engine was still running. Daniel shook off the impact, his ears ringing. Mike groaned beside him, gripping the wheel. The SUV stopped. Their doors opened. Dark figures stepped out. No sirens, no badges, just shadows moving toward them. Daniel reached for his holster. "We have to move." Mike was already ahead of him, fumbling for the gear shift. But before he could throw the car in reverse, something hit the windshield. A single deliberate bullet. A warning. Daniel's breath caught. The figures didn't run. They didn't yell. They just kept walking, slow and controlled, like they already knew how this was going to end. Mike clenched his jaw. "They don't want us dead." Daniel understood what he meant. If they wanted to kill them, they wouldn't have aimed for the windshield first. This wasn't about violence. This was about silence. They wanted the files. Daniel's grip tightened on the folder still in his hands. They weren't going to get them. Mike met his eyes. "We have one shot at this." Daniel nodded. "Then let's take it." And with that, they made their move. Mike slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement as the squad car lurched backward. The figures in the tunnel reacted instantly, raising weapons, not to shoot, but to intimidate, to control. The message was clear. Stop now, and this doesn't get worse. Daniel wasn't listening. His pulse thundered in his ears as he gripped the files tighter. The truth was in their hands, and if they let these men take it, everything Langston had risked would be for nothing. The squad car jerked violently as Mike spun the wheel, angling for a gap between the parked SUVs. The space was tight, barely enough to squeeze through, but it was their only chance. Then another vehicle appeared, this time from behind. A fourth SUV, blocking their escape. Mike cursed under his breath. "We're boxed in." Daniel's mind raced. They had two options: surrender or fight their way out. But surrender wasn't an option, not when they knew what was at stake. He reached for the radio again, even though he knew it was pointless. No response, no backup, no one was coming for them. One of the men in black stepped forward, close enough for Daniel to make out the faint outline of his face. His expression was calm, too calm for someone about to take down 2 police officers. This wasn't just another job for him. He had done this before. The man stopped a few feet away from the squad car. He raised a hand, palm open, a silent order. "Give us the files." Mike's grip on the wheel tightened. His breathing was steady, but Daniel could see it, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Then, out of nowhere, a loud roar of an engine echoed through the tunnel. Bright headlights flooded the space from the entrance. A new vehicle, moving fast. The men in black turned sharply, momentarily distracted. And that's when the sedan barreled into the scene. It was an old car, dented and barely holding together, but it was moving like a missile. It swerved straight toward the blockade, and at the last second, it skidded to a violent stop, tires screeching against concrete. The driver's side door flung open. Langston, his gun was drawn, and his face was set with pure determination. "Get in." Daniel didn't hesitate. He shoved open his door and bolted toward the sedan. Mike was right behind him. The men in black reacted, reaching for their weapons, but Langston was faster. He fired twice, not to hit, but to force them to cover. Daniel dove into the back seat, Mike barely making it in before Langston slammed the gas pedal. The car rocketed forward, scraping against the tunnel walls as Langston maneuvered through the chaos. Bullets pinged against the back of the car, but the old sedan held. Daniel twisted around, trying to catch a glimpse of their pursuers, but the tunnel was fading behind them. They were out. For now. Langston's hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw locked. "Told you to move fast." Mike let out a breathless laugh, part shock, part adrenaline. "Yeah, you could have mentioned you were following us." Langston didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, checking to see if they were being followed. Daniel tried to process what had just happened. "How did you find us?" Langston shook his head. "Didn't need to. The second you left, I knew they'd be coming for you." Mike frowned. "Who the hell are they?" Langston hesitated for just a second. "They're not cops." Daniel's stomach dropped. He had suspected as much, but hearing Langston confirm it made it worse. "They're the reason these files exist," Langston continued. "The ones who pull the strings. The ones Holloway answers to." Mike's eyes widened. "You're saying this goes beyond the department?" Langston nodded. "Way beyond." Daniel felt his pulse hammering again. He had thought this was about exposing corruption in the department, about bringing down Holloway and the officers under him. But this wasn't just about cops protecting their own. This was bigger. And they had just made themselves targets. Langston pulled the car into a dimly lit alley and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. For a few moments, no one spoke. Then Langston turned in his seat, looking at them both. "You need to disappear." Mike scoffed. "Yeah, and go where?" Langston's face was grim. "Anywhere but here. Holloway and his people aren't going to stop. And now it's not just your jobs on the line, it's your lives." Daniel swallowed hard. He knew Langston was right. But running wasn't an option. They had come too far to back down now. Langston must have seen the look on his face because he sighed. "I figured you'd say that." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. He handed it to Daniel. "Burner. There's one number saved in it. Call it when you're ready." Mike took the phone, turning it over in his hands. "Who's on the other end?" Langston hesitated again. "Someone who can help. But if you call that number, there's no turning back." Daniel met Langston's eyes. "There's no turning back anyway." Langston exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Then let's finish this." And just like that, the game had changed. The fight wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about survival. The old Satan sat in the alley, its engine ticking as it cooled. The air inside was heavy with tension. Daniel gripped the burner phone, his thumb hovering over the single saved contact. His mind was racing. There was no turning back now. The files in their hands had already set events in motion, and Holloway's people weren't going to stop until the last loose end was tied up, until every trace of the truth was erased, including them. Mike exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. So we call this number, and what? Hope for a miracle. Langston leaned back against the seat, his expression unreadable. Not a miracle, just a way to level the playing field. Daniel pressed the call button. The line rang once, then twice. Then a voice answered. Calm, steady. Go to Pier 17, Slit 4, 20 minutes. The call disconnected before Daniel could respond. Mike turned to Langston. That didn't sound like a cop. Langston shook his head. That's because he isn't. Daniel didn't ask any more questions. There was no time for doubts. Langston started the car, pulling out of the alley and onto the dark streets. The city lights blurred past as they weaved through empty roads, moving toward the waterfront. None of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the distant echoes of sirens in the city, sirens that weren't coming for them. Not yet. The docks were quiet, abandoned at this hour. The scent of salt and rust hung heavy in the air. Langston killed the headlights as they approached Slit 4. A single figure stood near the edge, his back to them. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and radiated the kind of presence that made it clear he wasn't the kind of man you crossed lightly. Langston cut the engine. Follow my lead. The three of them stepped out of the car, the files clutched tightly in Daniel's hand. The man didn't turn until they were just a few steps away. When he did, Daniel felt a shiver crawl down his spine. He wasn't a stranger. It was Holloway. Mike tensed beside him, his hand instinctively drifting toward his holster. What the hell is this? Holloway's face was calm, unreadable. Put the guns away, officers. We're just talking. Langston took a step forward. You think we're stupid enough to believe that? Holloway sighed, almost like he was disappointed. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it here. Daniel's mind was spinning. This wasn't the ambush he had expected. Holloway wasn't here with his men, wasn't armed to take them down. He had come alone. Mike wasn't buying it. You've been hunting us all night, and now you just want to talk. Holloway's gaze shifted to Daniel. I want to make you an offer. Daniel tightened his grip on the files. We're not for sale. Holloway let out a low chuckle. No, I don't suppose you are. But you don't understand what you've stepped into. This isn't about me. It's not about some dirty cops skimming money or making bad deals. It's bigger than that. Langston narrowed his eyes. Then why are you here? Holloway took a slow breath. Because you think exposing the truth is going to fix anything. You think bringing this into the light is going to make a difference. It won't. You're fighting against something too big to stop. Daniel felt his stomach twist. He had suspected this went beyond Holloway, beyond a few corrupt officers, but hearing it from the man himself made it real. Mike shook his head. So that's it. You're just going to keep playing along? Let them own you. Holloway's expression darkened. You don't get it. I don't have a choice. Daniel took a step closer. Neither do we. For the first time, Holloway's mask slipped. His jaw clenched, and a flicker of something almost like regret passed over his face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He looked at the files in Daniel's hands. If you release that information, you won't just be taking me down. You'll be putting a target on your backs forever. These people, he hesitated, they don't forgive, they don't forget, and they don't leave loose ends. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to believe Holloway was bluffing, that this was just another tactic to scare them off. But something in his voice told him it wasn't. Mike glanced at Langston. So what's the play? Langston exhaled. We do what we came here to do. Holloway shook his head. You're making a mistake. Daniel met his gaze. Maybe, but at least it's ours. For the first time that night, Holloway looked tired. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the dock. The silence that followed was heavy. Mike let out a shaky breath. Did that just happen? Langston nodded slowly. Yeah, and it means we don't have much time. Daniel looked down at the files, then out toward the city's skyline. Holloway had tried to scare them, to make them believe this fight wasn't worth it. But that only meant one thing. It was. They had to finish what they started, even if it meant facing what came next. The night air was thick with the scent of salt and gasoline as the three of them stood near the water, watching the last trace of Holloway disappear into the shadows. None of them spoke for a long moment. It wasn't relief they felt, more like the eerie calm before a storm they knew was still coming. Mike let out a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair. That was surreal. He just walked away. Daniel tightened his grip on the files. Because he knows we're already in too deep. He thinks we'll do his job for him. Either we back down, or we get taken out and his hands stay clean. Langston shook his head. That's the difference between him and us. He made his choice a long time ago. We still have one. Daniel looked down at the stack of papers, at all the names, the numbers, the undeniable proof of everything Holloway and his people had done. But Holloway had made one thing clear. This went far beyond him. Even if they took him down, there were others waiting in the shadows to fill his place. Mike crossed his arms. So what now? We drop this and just go back to work like nothing happened. Langston met his gaze, his voice steady. We finish it, but we do it right. Daniel glanced between them. We leak it. Langston nodded. Not to the department, not to anyone who can bury it. We go outside, somewhere they can't control. Mike let out a low whistle. That's gonna put a target on us. Daniel nodded. Yeah, but if we don't do it, no one else will. Langston pulled out a second burner phone and dialed a number. He didn't say much, just a time and a place. Then he hung up. That was a reporter, he said. She's good. One of the few left who actually wants the truth out there. We get this to her, she'll make sure the whole world knows. Mike exhaled sharply. Then we better move. They drove in silence, winding through the city streets, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They all knew the risks. Even if the truth came out, there were no guarantees. Holloway was just a symptom of something bigger, something that wasn't going to disappear overnight. But it had to start somewhere. The meeting spot was an old diner just off the highway. Quiet. Safe. They pulled into the lot and scanned the area before stepping inside. The reporter was already there, seated in a booth near the back. She was young, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that told Daniel she had seen more than most. She had the look of someone who had spent years chasing stories no one wanted told. Langston slid into the seat across from her and placed the files on the table. This is it. She didn't hesitate. She flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. After a long moment, she looked up. This is bigger than I thought. Mike smirked. Yeah, we've been hearing that a lot. The reporter closed the folder and nodded. I'll run with it, but you need to be ready. When this goes public, it's not just Holloway who's going to come after you. Daniel swallowed hard. He had known that already, but hearing it out loud made it real. Langston leaned back in his seat. We've been ready. The reporter studied them for a moment, then grabbed her bag and slipped the files inside. You might want to lay low for a while. Mike let out a short laugh. Yeah, no kidding. She stood up, gave them one last look, then walked out. For a moment, none of them moved. Daniel let out a slow breath. It's done. Langston nodded. For now. They left the diner together, stepping back into the cool night air. The city stretched out in front of them, the lights flickering like stars against the darkness. They had done what they came to do, but the fight wasn't over. It never would be. Mike glanced over at them. So, what do we do now? Daniel thought for a moment, then cracked a small smile. We get some sleep. Langston chuckled. For once, I agree. They climbed back into the car, the weight of everything they had been through settling onto their shoulders. The road ahead wasn't clear. There were still battles to fight, still dangers lurking in the shadows. But for the first time in a long time, they had done the right thing. And no matter what came next, they wouldn't regret it.